A number of people have asked me what I think about the migration crisis, specifically in the context of Germany. And I'm going to be taking a different perspective and a different route in this video than a lot of the other videos you might have seen out there addressing this issue. For those of you who don't know, I'm pretty familiar with Germany as a whole. I know the language inside out. I know the people. I know the culture. I know the history going back to the Holy Roman Empire. I know Germany. But bear in mind, everything I'm about to say in this video is also related to what I said in the previous video. My concerns and the way I address these things are philosophical and intellectual at best. You know, I'm a guy who ekes out a living through odd jobs on the internet. The migration crisis, in largest measure, doesn't affect me, not directly. And so I don't really have a stake in this game or really a horse in this race, at least not in the most direct sense. These are just observations and sort of philosophical concerns, if you will. But as I said, I want to take a different perspective on this issue because Germany, for historical reasons, is in a somewhat different position than some European countries. Well, not entirely if you consider some other issues. So let's start with a concept that is often talked about in German literature and certainly in academia, and it's something that most German people who have some education are familiar with. This concept, this term, is called Vergangenheitsbewältigung. Now, Vergangenheitsbewältigung is most often translated as coming to terms with the past. Bewältigung by itself means to sort of overcome or to resolve an issue. And Vergangenheit is the past, understandably. And Vergangenheitsbewältigung really, these days, almost exclusively has the meaning of pertaining to German crimes during World War II, the Nazi regime, etc. And it's something that is pervasive and persistent in the German mentality, certainly at the political level, absolutely at the political level, and certainly on in the intellectual level in academia and so on and so forth. This is something that's been around for 60, 70 years now, Vergangenheitsbewältigung. And I have very specific perspectives on the concept of Vergangenheitsbewältigung. I've had enough conversations with some Germans about this, and I will be talking about that at length. But that's an important term to be familiar with, Vergangenheitsbewältigung. So when I talk about it henceforth, coming to terms with the past, you know what I'm talking about. And there's something else I want to address in the context of Germany, but also in the context of larger context of Western civilization. Many years ago, I produced a video that talked about the differences between shame and guilt. And I think in this context, it's helpful to recap some of the key things that I had brought up. So Germany is a Western country. And you take a country like Korea or Japan, I think is a good example here. They have very different mentalities. Western culture in general, Western civilization, tends to be guilt-based. Eastern, Far Eastern culture, like Korean culture and Japanese culture, tend to be shame-based. And one of the primary differences and outcomes of the direction of these cultures, and I'm not claiming here, by the way, that Western people are genetically more predisposed to feeling guilty as opposed to shameful things and vice versa. These are just how the dice ended up in terms of history. I think it could have gone either way had circumstances been different, but that's what we have these days. Christianity, of course, is a great testament to this. Collective and inherited guilt, or as I like to call it, inherited culpability. And I'm not claiming this is specifically a Christian inheritance. All ideologies, ideas, philosophies, religious or otherwise, capitalize on some human instinct or some human attribute. And in this case, you could say Christianity capitalized on the human instinct and the human feeling of guilt. I'm not saying that Christianity is the source of this, it's human nature ultimately, but I think it was a rather large contributing factor, as well as there's a factor of legacy. But by and large, Germany is a quote-unquote guilt culture versus a shame culture. And you can see this in the difference between how Germany has handled its past and how Japan has handled its past. So in reference to Japanese wartime atrocities, colonial crimes, etc., it's well known that oftentimes the Japanese will just omit it from history books and just not bring it up. It's, that which shall not be mentioned. Germans take a completely different perspective. From the get-go, I don't know how it is in 2015, at the end of 2015, but certainly the last decade or two, the school children that are now adults, they had been inundated with things related to World War II and what had happened. They're very well familiar with it, etc. And Vergangenheitsbewältigung attempts to, I guess, as a concept, sort of how do you deal with a past like that, and so on and so forth. And you wouldn't have Vergangenheitsbewältigung as an overarching concept in reference to World War II and what happened there if you didn't have the notion of collective inherited culpability. You can't really have inherited culpability in a shame culture. So I only mention, say, Japan in the context of Japanese colonialism, and Korea, of course, which didn't have that same history, but it's a shame culture for sure, to make a distinction. What we see going on today with regards to migrants or immigrants or refugees or whoever these people ultimately are, and what you see Germany doing really when it comes to any of these issues that might be related to this, is a reenactment of this kind of Vergangenheitsbewältigung that Germans to this day, culturally, historically, have had to live with a kind of, well, collective inherited culpability that has been reassigned to each generation. Now, personally, I think this is ludicrous. Why is it ludicrous? It's ludicrous for lack of evidence. Someone who doesn't believe, on good scientific grounds that I've presented many times, doesn't believe in free will, it's kind of ridiculous to posit that the crimes of people 70, 80, 60 years ago, etc., that this is somehow related to you and that you have inherited this. I mean, inherited sin essentially is what this is. Original sin, same thing, Christian concept, but we see it alive and well in modern German culture. And many Germans, especially liberal educated Germans, and most of my friends are German friends, are liberal educated, the vast majority of them, that is left-leaning, and if not even progressive. And those of you know, I'm anti-progressive. I don't share their politics. I perhaps share some of their education, but that's about it. They probably would say that Vergangenheitsbewältigung and original sin, inherited culpability are still very much relevant to today, but I don't really think they are, not anymore. The problem with inherited culpability is that it never really ends. And I've had this conversation with Germans. I've said in German, die Vergangenheitsbewältigung kann niemals abgeschlossen werden, which I've never had this conversation in German, which roughly translates literally as the coming to terms with the past can never be completed. And that's true. If the deeds of the past are a marker that continually remarks the present as something that's relevant to that particular period, no matter what the temporal distance, it's a task that can never be completed. There is no coming to terms with the past if the past is still in the present. So Germany suffers from collective guilt. Not everyone. I mean, Joe the plumber doesn't give a shit about these issues. But certainly the so-called intelligentsia, academic community, the political scene is supercharged with notions of Vergangenheitsbewältigung and historical sadness regarding the past and what have you. Now, I'm not denying that the things in the past were horrible. I don't think the NS regime was a particularly good period in history to have lived. It was pretty atrocious. But at some point in time, people need to move on. That's true of individuals as well as nations. Collective inherited culpability doesn't really serve anyone. It doesn't help make society, it doesn't help move society forward. And I'm not even saying this is unique to Germany. You see this in Anglo-Saxon countries such as Canada, the United States, with notions of inherited culpability, although to a much, much lesser degree, I would argue, with regards to indigenous peoples, Native Americans who had arrived thousands of years prior to other people, and the displacement of their territories and their homeland and so on. You see this to a much lesser degree in the context of the Americas. And a lot of people call this white guilt. I think white guilt is a pretty terrible description because it's something actually used often by white nationalists. Because it's a bad description because it assumes that ethnic Polish person is somehow genetically identical to an Irish person, though they nominally have white skin. This is not true. Just as West Africans are genetically distinct from East Africans, Eastern Europeans, Southern Europeans, Northern Europeans are ethnically distinct and genetically distinct as well. So I kind of refer to this once again as inherited culpability. I think this is much more based on ideas. And indeed, in the context of something like the British Empire, the UK, absolutely there's a kind of colonial guilt, which isn't, once again, as pervasive as the issue that persists in Germany, but it's still present. And basically, this inherited culpability renders people unable to say no. There is a conflict of interest, in a sense, between the desire to show empathy as well as being racked by a kind of historical guilt, as well as the desire to be reasonable. Reasonable in the sense that some things simply cannot come to pass without serious and oftentimes negative consequences. Open doors policy on immigration, letting in hundreds of thousands of immigrants willy-nilly, it's probably not the best idea, to say the least, and I'm saying that euphemistically. But people do it, particularly in Germany. We've seen it. I mean, most recently, we've seen Angela Merkel, the chancellor, pose with an immigrant, and it looks as if she's off her rocker. In 2010, she claimed that multiculturalism had failed in Germany. And it seems she's reversing her position, and there are all kinds of theories as to why that's the case. I'm not going to speculate. I don't really know. I mean, she's a career politician. Before that, she was a physicist. I wish she had stayed a physicist. But the problem really is, I think, throughout Europe for the most part, and there are basically few European countries without a past. I mean, Holland had a trading empire. Spain is pretty obvious. Portugal, France, UK, Germany has its World War II, and so on. But you don't really see this. I mean, nominally you could claim that Hungary was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's true. Some of these smaller Eastern European countries, they don't have these same feelings. Now, I think it's very telling, and it's a salient point, because these countries don't have either the sort of world-spanning colonial past, and they don't have some sort of definitive event that everyone in the world is aware of. I mean, everybody knows about Hitler, and everyone knows about World War II, at least to some degree. The inner conflicts within Hungarian borders or Croatia or what have you, these are lesser known. And so the motivations of people, even though, I mean, there are people in those countries, there are people who oppose certain right-wing policies in Hungary that are Hungarians, they're left-leaning Hungarians, but this burden of guilt is not something that smaller countries tend to suffer from. It seems to be pretty uniquely those countries that have some sort of colonial past or some sort of historical past that's well known and well documented and also not particularly savory and pleasant, such in the case of Germany. In the case of Canada and the United States, to a much lesser degree, you have the displacement and the killing of Native Americans, who, if you look at actual historical these were not well-behaved peoples. I'm not saying that was justified either way, but these people were not peaceful, living in harmony. These are pretty savage people, just like human beings universally across the globe are. Human beings are pretty violent. Getting past this would be the key, I think, to sensible policies regarding mass immigration. That is to say, instead of the EU is now setting, I want to make a separate video about what I think about the EU and this insane bureaucracy they created, but the EU is now setting immigration quotas and what have you, and Germany is sort of leading it all. Until Germany reaches a point where it can get rid of this term, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which really is how much more do you want to deal with that? We know what happened in the past. I not endorsing what happened. It was absolutely horrific. I don't think anyone in their right mind would, but that the past should not serve as a blockade to sensible policies that might make us wince away in a kind of a lack of empathy. But sometimes we can't be empathetic. Sometimes we don't have an option of being compassionate, whatever the situation might be. I'm talking about this in a general sense. So emotion is often, as my friend has pointed out, emotions are a useful servant but a terrible master. I mean, if emotion, in the sense of guilt and collective inherited culpability, if these are a guiding principle and a guiding force in directing policy, I think you can pretty much assume that the ship is sailing in the wrong direction. And this is absolutely what's happened with Germany. Germany is obsessed with its past. It doesn't want to let go of it. At least in the political scene and the intellectual scene. As I said, Joe the plumber doesn't really give a shit about this stuff. But then again, Joe the plumber doesn't give a shit about anything anywhere Joe the plumber might live, be it in Spain, Germany, United States, Canada, whatever. Moving past this would be a key, but it's I don't think it's going to happen because, well, just because reasons. That's the way it is. I mean, Germany has this past, and I think 20 years from now, if we're still alive, we'll still be talking about and having conversations about Vergangenheitsbewältigung. Although obviously in 20 years' time, if we're still alive, the landscape of Germany is going to look vastly different. So, it really is something that doesn't have a solution until one of the fundamental problems in German culture and society is addressed in the context of Germany and in the larger context of Western society, the notion of inherited culpability, which scientifically doesn't have much sense to it, and practically doesn't have much sense to it. I mean, every person here alive probably can find some ancestor, although it might not be historically tested, that committed horrific crimes and you somehow benefited, at the very least you inherited his DNA or whatever. This is just a bad argument. So the key here is to really get past the past. If they can't get past the past, then Germany is going to be stuck in this loop, as well as the rest of Western civilization. Now, once again, as a guy who scrapes by doing odd jobs on the internet, I don't really have a stake or a horse in this race. There are other people who are much more affected by this. These are sort of philosophical observations and concerns, and I don't see a solution to the German problem if some of these larger philosophical, historical questions are not answered, or actually if these issues are not called into question. If you have an eternal Vergangenheitsbewältigung that is the determining factor in determining policy, then yeah, that's going to be a problem. And I think to a lesser degree, even though we don't use the term we're not German, but in the Americas and other places, there's also a kind of Vergangenheitsbewältigung. Nobody really these days endorses colonial barbarities of the past. Nobody, at least who was politically correct, would go talk about the white man's duty or anything like that. But people, nobody thinks these are good things for the most part. Few people, I think. But there's a point in time where we need to move past this collectively as a civilization. I don't really see the point as to why Germans need to wallow in this perpetually. But then again, I'm an outsider. I am an observer. I live in Germany. I'm familiar with the language and the culture and the history and the people and the bureaucracy. And there are certain things that are pretty alien to me about Germans to this day. But this is my observation. This is my solution. This actually has to be an intellectual discussion, sort of essentially absolving Germans of their past, of past misdeeds committed 70 plus years ago. Until that happens, nothing's going to change in Germany. Not regarding all these very, I guess, liberal left-wing policies that are so pervasive, as well as open border policies and everything that's just kind of associated with what modern Germany is. That is a consequence, in my view, of just a historical process that's never been resolved, and Vergangenheitsbewältigung. In other cases, you have, the colonial past, or the case of Native Americans. Yeah, let's face it, most people don't give a shit about this stuff. My non-urgency, we're not affected, whatever. But policies are often based on some of these notions, and certainly in intellectual circles, these are issues. So I actually see this as an intellectual issue, whether it comes down to Germany or the UK or whatever, that in light of either, say, a colonial past or a particularly turbulent and unpleasant historical past, people are unwilling to make difficult decisions, which, for that matter, they're not cruel decisions. No one's advocating actively harming migrants or immigrants, but having a stricter policy, and having a policy that is more reflective of a reality that we all live in, is sound and not a bad thing. Otherwise, and if we continue down this road, I don't want to see extreme parties in power of any sort. I don't want to see extreme leftist, extreme rightist, which is not to say I'm right of center or left of center. I'm political, whatever. You give me an issue, I'll tell you what my thoughts are. But it's very difficult to pinpoint what I am, although people have called me everything from a Marxist to a far right wing, whatever. I'm nothing, and I'm everything in between. I go by the issue. But here's the thing. Until we get to the point where we can acknowledge that, mass murder, conquest, etc., these are not somehow, can't be equated to having a restrictive immigration policy or a more restrictive one, that these are not the same things, we're going to get nowhere, and rather fast. So I think long term, these policies are really bad, and there's not much that can be done until there's a philosophical and intellectual turnaround in the consciousness of politics and intellectuals and people who are interested in this stuff. I don't see it happening. The Germans are going to be coming to terms with their past forever, I think, probably, and the rest of the world will too. And this is, I think, dangerous, because we're going to see the danger of real extreme parties that really would physically harm people and do all kinds of things that I don't think anyone in their right mind wants to see come to power. But anyway, those are my thoughts on specifically Germany and the larger issue of migration. Like I said, different perspective, more reflective of history and sort of psychological concerns than anything else. But everyone, as usual, thanks for watching, and stay frosty. Bye-bye.